Hello, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar on psychedelic integration. My name is Meredith Drinkle, and I'm a committee member with the Australian Psychedelic Society, and it is my absolute pleasure to host the event this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. For me here, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that out to the land that you are streaming from today and encourage you to write it in the chat if you know which land you are on. I acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. I am very, very excited for tonight's event, which is a collaboration between the Australian Psychedelic Society and Enlighten Mental Health. This webinar is also being recorded and will be made available afterwards on our YouTube channel. Psychedelic integration is an often overlooked aspect of the psychedelic experience, yet it is arguably the most important. Once a person returns to ordinary states of consciousness, the psychedelic trip, whether perceived as positive or negative, is often left in the rearview mirror to fade like a dream. One of the key points of integration is to not let significant parts of the experience fade out, but rather to take a deep dive and mine it for valuable insights and integrate it into our lives. This workshop is going to discuss why integration is an important part of the psychedelic journey and the tips and tools to effectively integrate your psychedelic experience. The session will be facilitated by clinical psychologist Dr. Shevaugn Johnson from Enlighten Mental Health. And I encourage that everyone who has any comments or questions to type them in the Q&A box, because at the end we are going to have an opportunity where Shevaugn is going to be answering some of your questions. So feel free to type them in at any time. But before we get into the presentation, I'd like to give a bit of a background and overview of who we are at the Australian Psychedelic Society. Established since 2016 and becoming incorporated in 2018, the Australian Psychedelic Society, or APS for short, has a passionate committee of 14 members led by our president, Dr. Samuel Douglas. The APS has chapters and groups in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Canberra, Perth, and the Victorian Goldfields, with a network of volunteers from across the country. We also have plans to develop other groups and chapters in more regional areas across Australia. The APS is part of a larger global movement with psychedelic societies already established in the USA, the UK, and in Europe. We hope that in creating communities, we can better advocate for the decriminalisation of psychedelics and break stigmas associated with psychedelic use. APS hosts events such as book clubs, psychedelic story events, bushwalks, ethnobotany workshops, and film screenings. The purposes of APS include providing educational resources to the psychedelic community, representing and advocating for the psychedelic community, and supporting psychedelic research to increase benefits to society. And by creating a cohesive network, it is hoped that changes in drug policy, education, and use will be established based on evidence-based information rather than fear-based misinformation. It is also important to mention that the APS hosts integration circles, and these are currently running or have run across Brisbane, Perth, and Melbourne, with plans to expand this out to other chapters. The APS integration circles are facilitated by trained therapeutic professionals and are a space for peer support and like-minded community to learn about integration. Please do check out our website, www.psychedelicsociety.org.au, for any integration circles that might be happening in your area. It is now my absolute great pleasure to hand over to the CEO and founder of Enlighten Mental Health, Eternity Housing.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Meredith, and thank you to everyone who has come along this evening to meet the Enlighten Mental Health team. and learn more about what we're doing at Enlighten Mental Health. This is our first webinar since we launched Enlighten Mental Health, and we are so pleased to hear that this event has been sold out and humbled by the response. My name is Eternity Housen, and I'm the CEO and founder of Enlighten Mental Health. Tonight, we're going to cover a lot of ground, beginning with the Enlighten team and the services we offer. So I'm just going to share my screen now. I have a presentation ready for this evening. Hey, everybody. I can see everyone saying hi in the chat. Hello, hello. Wonderful. Tonight, we're going to cover a lot of ground, beginning with the Enlighten Mental Health team and the services we offer. I'll then pass the floor to Dr. Shevaugn Johnson, our clinical psychologist, who will cover a brief history of psychedelics in science and medicine, how psychedelics work in the brain, indications, safety profile, harm reduction, integration. What is it? Integration for practitioners and community members. And we will then do 2 integration activities, which I think you'll all enjoy very much. This will be followed by 15 minutes of question time. We are pleased to be a part of these exciting times in Australia as we lead the way as Australia's first online mental health clinic, specialising in psychedelic integration. This has been a long time coming for many of us here on the Enlighten board and team. With your support, we hope to lead the way forward in Australia and continue to offer safe and ethical services to our clients. Let me introduce you to our wonderful team. Beginning with our board, we have myself and my co-founder, Emily Hetherington. Emily and I are both current serving members of the Australian Defence Force. I've spent over 15 years in the Army, and Emily is currently a serving officer in the Australian Navy. Combined, we have over 28 years of military experience and have both studied psychology. Our final 2 board members and co-founders are Graham Barry, who's here on the call tonight, who has a strong interest in alleviating end-of-life anxiety through psilocybin and mental health outcomes generally. And of course, Alex Housen, who currently works part-time at Enlighten Mental Health and full-time as a high school teacher. At Enlighten Mental Health, we have a diverse team consisting of people from a range of backgrounds. My current role in the military is as an intelligence analyst, and from working on time-sensitive critical missions, it has become evident to me that a broad range of ideas and perspectives is what contributes to the success of the team. That is why at Enlighten Mental Health, we search far and wide to find the very best people for our team. Moving on now to our therapists. We have Dr. Shevaugn Johnson, who you'll be meeting shortly, Blake Johns, who is our clinical counsellor, our reception and administration dream team, Caitlin, Sophia and Violet, who you may have spoken to on the phone. They keep Enlighten up and running. Moving now to our 3 ambassadors. Our first ambassador is Nick Littlemore, who we are pleased to partner with. You may recognise him from the band Panau or Empire of the Sun, or perhaps the latest #1 hit Cold Heart with Elton John and Dua Lipa. Nick is an advocate for plant medicines and assists us with our social media reach in Australia and overseas. Dr. Nicola Santa Rosa and Meg have a strong research and clinical interest in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy and conduct advocacy activities, as well as keep our research page up to date on our website. We are rapidly growing and are currently on the hunt for a new clinical psychologist. So if you watch this webinar, like what we're about and want to contribute in a meaningful way, please send your CV through afterwards. At Enlighten Mental Health, we offer a range of services which can be broken down into typical therapy one may seek throughout the course of their life. Given my service and Emily's service in the military, it is really important to us that we have an impact on current and ex-serving ADF members and their families, which is why we offer our services through several different channels for ADF members and their families. We also offer psychedelic integration services, or aftercare as some prefer. Please note that it is not yet possible to offer psilocybin or other substances to our clients under the current scheduling rules. Our services can be broken down into 3 categories at this point: clinical psychology, clinical counselling, and psychedelic integration services. It is important to note that our therapists offer evidence-based services to the general community. We are, however, more than a mental health clinic. We offer high-quality service and deliver our services with compassion and care. Before we move on to Shevaugn, I just want to make a quick note here that We do not advocate for the recreational use of psychedelics, but we do recognise and respect people's autonomy and the rich history of psychedelic use that has occurred outside of the laboratory. We understand and acknowledge the importance of the work we do and the impact it may have on many people's lives now and for future generations. This is why we take great care and pride in our work. We do not believe psychedelics are a one-size-fits-all. They are not a panacea. At Enlighten Mental Health, we are not advocating for recreational use, but rather we acknowledge that people are using these substances anyways and are thus deserving of accurate information and, if warranted, an opportunity to share their experiences with therapists who are non-judgmental and who can draw upon evidence-based therapeutic approaches to assist with the integration process. I'll now move on to introduce who will be taking the floor after me, Dr. Shevaugn Johnson. Dr. Shevaugn Johnson is originally from Canada, where she trained as a surgical and mental health nurse and obtained a bachelor's degree in psychology with honours. In 2016, Dr. Johnson was awarded the Flinders International Postgraduate Research Scholarship to study a doctorate degree in clinical psychology. She specialised in the research of body dysmorphic disorder, winning 2 higher degree research publication awards. Throughout the completion of her doctorate, Dr. Johnson developed a special interest in the use of psychedelics to alleviate mental health problems. Drawing upon a Canadian database, she is currently collaborating with North American researchers to replicate a 2015 population-based study, which found that lifetime use of classic psychedelics predicted lower suicidality and psychological distress. Dr. Johnson has also published case reports of individuals who reported to have benefited from this use of psychedelics and is currently working on a protocol for a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy trial in South Australia. Dr. Johnson has extensive experience working with diverse mental health populations, including post-traumatic stress disorder, personality disorders, and substance use disorders. She's a strong advocate for the dissemination of education surrounding the safe use of psychedelics and hopes to continue working with like-minded individuals who recognise the transdiagnostic potential of these medicines. And with that, I will pass the floor to Dr. Johnson.
Oh, thank you for that lovely introduction. So today I will be providing a brief overview of the psychedelic literature before transitioning to harm reduction psychedelic integration. So I've structured it such that the wider community can go away with an understanding of what integration might look like. And I've included a couple of group experiential exercises. I've also structured this presentation such that it might be beneficial to those clinicians already working or planning to work in this space by drawing upon specific evidence-based psychotherapeutic techniques. It is also my hope that by discussing these techniques, this will give the wider community an understanding about the types of therapies that might be best suited to their individual needs and own integration practice. So human beings have been consuming psilocybin-containing mushrooms for centuries, and since the first wave of literature in the 1950s, psychedelics have been investigated as therapeutic aids in the treatment of mental illness. The use of psychedelic-assisted treatments for mental illness is predicated on an extensive body of literature, with much scientific research conducted between the 1950s and 70s. These studies found promising results for the treatment of anxiety disorders, end-of-life distress, mood disorders, sexual dysfunction, and substance use disorders. A 2012 meta-analysis involving 6 randomized control trials dated between 1966 and 1970 found that, relative to controls, a single dose of lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, significantly reduced the symptoms of alcohol misuse. So associations with counterculture movement, propagation of false claims by the media, and unregulated use of these substances were some of the factors that led to the implementation of drug policies in the 1960s and 70s that paused this research for several decades. Prior to this early research ending due to legal and funding barriers, approximately 40,000 patients were treated with psychedelics in the 1950s and 60s, with over 1,000 papers reporting positive results. The second wave of research was initiated in the 1990s, and there are currently several psychedelic substances, for example, psilocybin, MDMA, ketamine, ibogaine, LSD, and dimethyltryptamine or DMT, with varying pharmacological mechanisms of action that have demonstrated efficacy in treating a broad spectrum of mental health conditions. Psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, and DMT are considered the classic psychedelics. So they act as partial agonists on serotonin receptors. Classic psychedelics are known to produce marked alterations to perception, cognition, and affect, and to produce feelings of transcendence of space and time, unity, ineffability, meaning beyond words, paradoxicality, noetic quality or sense of revelation, and positive mood. There are emerging theories that attempt to explain the psychedelic experience, and the default mode network, or DMN, has garnered a lot of attention in the psychedelic literature over recent years. The DMN is described as a system of brain regions that is deactivated during goal-directed activities and activated during inward-directed processes involving autobiographical memory, forward thinking, self-referential processing of information, and theory of mind. These regions that comprise the DMN have been dubbed connector hubs, as they facilitate efficient communication between various brain regions, and 5-HT2A or serotonin receptors are densely expressed in areas of the cortex involved with high-level associations and information processing. This opens a hyperplastic window of opportunity for therapeutic change. It has been reported that the direct activation of excitatory neurons leads to a cascade of molecular and cellular changes, which is thought to lead to the desynchronization of neurons and destabilization of the DMN, and catalyzes the hyperconnectivity between various brain regions. Given the population, such as treatment-resistant depression, have abnormalities to network connectivity, this process is thought to act like a reset mechanism. So the key takeaway here is that the DMN might be thought of as the ego, and psychedelics seem to quiet the DMN and generate new connections between different areas of the brain. For example, in a person with depression, they might think to themselves, I am worthless, or I am not good enough. A person with body image disturbance might think, I am ugly and therefore unlovable, or I am fat. This can be thought of as the DMN maybe having a bit of a party, getting overexcited, and psychedelics seem to tame this down and reset that inner dialogue. In their 2019 paper, Carhart, Harris, and Friston proposed a model for conceptualizing the psychedelic experience known as relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, or REBUS. This model postulates that classic psychedelics weaken the top of the brain's hierarchical predictive models that engender core beliefs. Through this process, unrestricted cognitive processes permit novel modes of conceptualizing, including views held about the self, generating a window of opportunity to loosen rigid cognitive styles that maintain psychopathology. The key takeaway is that previously held rigid beliefs become more amenable to change, freeing us from that mental prison many of us know all too well. We'll also mention that the salience network, which main hubs include the anterior cingulate cortex and anterior insular cortex, is also thought to play a role in the psychedelic experience. For the purposes of this presentation, however, I will not go into detail about this. Interestingly, classic psychedelics have also been found to have anti-inflammatory properties, and the activation of the 5-HT2A or serotonin receptor produces dendritic spine growth and density, factors theorized to contribute to their antidepressant effects. In vitro and in vivo studies have found psilocybin to be associated with neuritogenesis, i.e. the sprouting of neurites from a cell, and spinogenesis, or the formation of dendritic spines in neurons. Psychological variables such as emotional breakthrough and psychological flexibility are factors through which psychedelics are postulated to exert their effects on psychopathological outcomes. This is in alignment with the literature that highlights psychological inflexibility and emotional suppression as factors maintaining a broad spectrum of psychopathology. An online study of 379 participants produced factor analytic results indicating emotional breakthrough as an important feature of the psychedelic experience. The authors reported that, like mystical experiences, emotional breakthrough was found to be a significant predictor of well-being. Furthermore, a cross-sectional study found psychological flexibility following the use of a wide range of psychedelics, for example, LSD, psilocybin, ibogaine, mescaline, to mediate the therapeutic effects. These results were consistent with a study conducted in 2016 that detected alterations to psychological flexibility during the acute effects of ayahuasca containing DMT. The use of psychedelics in psychotherapy can be associated with highly salient positive outcomes known as mystical experiences. As described earlier, this is characterized by experiences of unity, transcendence of space and time, noetic quality, so again, revelations, positive mood, ineffability, meaning beyond words, and sacredness. Mystical experiences have been found to play a key role in the positive therapeutic outcomes detected across the psychedelic literature. In a 2017 study by Carhart Harris and colleagues involving psilocybin-assisted therapy for treatment-resistant depression, mystical experiences mediated post-acute changes in the default mode network, which predicted treatment response at 5-week follow-up. Qualitative analysis on a psilocybin-assisted therapy for alcohol-dependent study found participants to attribute their behavior change to themes such as sacredness, internal-external unity, noetic quality, positive mood, ineffability, and transcendence. Moreover, psychedelic-assisted therapy for tobacco and alcohol addiction have found smoking cessation and reductions in aversive patterns of alcohol use to be correlated with measures assessing mystical experiences. Therefore, unlike the emotional blunting effects often observed in serotonergic promoting antidepressants, psilocybin-assisted therapy appears to have the added benefit of addressing the underlying root cause of suffering, such as the lack of meaning, connectedness, and insight. And while more research is needed to better understand the specific underlying mechanisms of therapeutic action, well-designed nascent research is highlighting the widespread potential of psilocybin-assisted therapy in populations with diverse mental health conditions. The key takeaway is that psychedelics have the propensity to elicit mystical experiences, which have been found to predict positive changes, and psilocybin does not seem to produce emotional blunting effects common in antidepressant treatment. So psilocybin-assisted therapy has demonstrated safety and efficacy for depression, end-of-life distress, and substance use disorders. There's also some research demonstrating potential efficacy in eating disorder and obsessive-compulsive disorder populations. MDMA-assisted psychotherapy has evidence of safety and efficacy for PTSD and preliminary evidence for social anxiety in adults with autism spectrum disorder. There is also evidence of safety and efficacy of ketamine for treatment-resistant depression and preliminary efficacy for its evidence of efficacy and safety in PTSD and substance use disorder. Furthermore, there is preliminary evidence for the effectiveness of ayahuasca and mood and substance use disorders, and LSD for distress in individuals with life-threatening illness and alcohol-related issues. So excitingly, the federal government announced earlier this year a $15 million grant scheme in Australia involving the use of psychedelics to treat mental illness. We at Enlighten hope to be involved in these trials as researchers, clinicians, and as a consumer advisory group. We get our results back this month. So there's an expanding record of clinical trials that have demonstrated the safety and efficacy of classic psychedelics. And what I mean by efficacy is that in a controlled environment, classic psychedelics have been found to help people. It is worth mentioning that psychedelics like MDMA and ketamine, when used in research trials, have also produced safe and effective results, but classic psychedelics have been found to be particularly safe. Unlike most substances used in clinical and research settings, classic psychedelics are unlikely to result in physiological toxicity, dependency, and do not produce neuropsychological or bodily organ damage. Moreover, psychological safety and the minimization of adverse events is enhanced in clinical setting by accounting for factors such as set and setting. Set refers to the person's mindset, expectations, and attitudes toward people around them, including their therapists, whereas setting refers to the environment, including factors such as music, artwork, again in a lab setting, maybe safety equipment. Classic psychedelics have not been linked to compulsive drug-seeking behaviors, which is consistent with animal models that have found no evidence for reliable self-administration. According to USONA Institute, there are no reported cases of pharmaceutical psilocybin overdoses. Additionally, there is no evidence to suggest any chromosomal, carcinogenic, meaning cancerous, teratogenic, meaning producing fetal defects, or mutagenic, meaning inducing genetic mutation, effects of psychedelics. Psilocybin has a particularly strong safety profile, which has been demonstrated in large trials at high doses. In a review of 20 psychoactive substances, it was found that compared to heroin, psilocybin had a safety margin several hundred times wider. Psilocybin had both the lowest dependence potential and acute toxicity of all substances evaluated, which included heroin, ketamine, cannabis, nicotine, caffeine, and alcohol. The key takeaway is that physiologically, classic psychedelics are quite safe. It is important to note, however, that when used outside the context of research trials, there are, of course, risks. For example, we don't recommend going out into the bush and picking your own psilocybin mushrooms, as they look very similar to gallerina and other mushrooms, which are highly toxic to humans. So before moving on to harm reduction, I would like to just take a minute to thank Dr. Stephen Bright and Dr. Martin Williams from Psychedelic Research in Science and Medicine, Professor Peter Hendricks from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, Dr. Vince Polito of Macquarie University, and Dr. Chris Lethaby from the University of Western Australia and Adelaide University for their input during the development of the psilocybin protocol, which informed the above-mentioned overview. And if you're wanting a more detailed overview of the psychedelic literature, you can check out Dr. Chris Lethaby's book. It's called Philosophy of Psychedelics, which you can find on our website. So what do we mean by harm reduction? So while we do not advocate for recreational use of psychedelics, like other substances, we acknowledge that people will use them regardless of their legal status. An example of harm reduction involving substances such as heroin might be the use of clean needle exchange programs or safe injection sites, which have been shown to reduce incidences of overdose, the contraction of bloodborne diseases, and higher rates of accessing substance use programs. Thus, to minimize potential harms, we adopt approaches that are aimed at minimizing the risks involved with a person's psychedelic use. While psychedelics, namely classic psychedelics, are physiologically very safe, they can increase the risk of psychological harm, again, especially when used outside the context of controlled clinical settings. Psychedelics can enhance suggestibility, leaving users more vulnerable. Unfortunately, there have been cases of individuals who have been taken advantage of sexually by those facilitating the psychedelic sessions. I've also seen cases of people who have struggled to exercise critical thinking following a psychedelic experience, taking everything that came up for them during the trip as literal truths. From my perspective, this is likely due to the noetic quality of psychedelics, and while many revelations might be deemed beneficial to mental health and represent a deeper truth, at any time human beings fail to question their thoughts and exercise critical judgment, they may be more vulnerable to harm. Harm reduction involves finding out what people already know about psychedelics and asking their permission to clarify misinformation and/or provide them with further psychoeducation. A practitioner might want to know whether the substances the person has used or plans to use have been tested either by the other people who are using them, or maybe by a drug testing kit. But it's probably worth noting that the classic psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin are not typically included in these kits. We might also advocate for the individual to speak to their GP or prescribing pharmacist about potential drug interactions. For example, serotonin syndrome can occur in individuals on serotonin-promoting medications, such as antidepressants or maybe tramadol. Practitioners might also have conversations about set and setting while balancing this with not promoting recreational use. So psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy has 3 phases. This is in the context of clinical trials. There's the preparation phase, the experimental phase, and the integration phase. And today we're just going to focus on integration. Now for my favorite part. So integration is the exploration of insights learned or challenges that arise during the psychedelic experience, which is used to assist with the installation of adaptive cognitive behavioral changes, so i.e., forming healthy habits. It is considered crucial to minimizing harms and maximizing the potential benefits of psychedelics. I usually start off the integration process by asking people about their mindset and what was happening in the days or even weeks before having used the psychedelic. This is particularly useful for those clients who have had difficult or even traumatic experiences, given that we know that the mindset or set, right, of the person and the environment setting in which the person has taken the psychedelic greatly influences the experiences that they have. The more difficult trips typically occur in individuals who had little to no education about psychedelics or misinformation about the physiological risks of these substances. Not always, but it does tend to increase the risk. So you can imagine that if someone was told that they will damage their brain cells and require institutionalization following an LSD trip, or fail to consider the environment the psychedelic was consumed, that there is a higher risk of an adverse response. Using a harm reduction model, if the client consents to further psychoeducation about psychedelics, this provides me with an opportunity to provide accurate information. I've found that this in and of itself can provide incredible relief to individuals who have had negative experiences, as it provides a context as to why this may have occurred in the first place. I then ask the person to relay what they can recall during the trip and ask open-ended questions to elicit as much information as possible. I also gain information about what happened in the days or weeks following the psychedelic experience, as this gives me some idea as to how much or if any integration was done. But of course, psychedelics can also produce favorable outcomes, and some people have intentions to continue their use of psychedelics, or perhaps they have ongoing medical access to things like ketamine infusions. In these instances, I find it helpful to ask the person to keep an integration journal so that evidence-based exercises can be devised by drawing on this content. While I'm mindful not to evangelize these substances, the psychedelic experience can initiate a trajectory of personal and, for some, spiritual evolution, which is more of a process of unlearning than it is learning. Psychologists work tirelessly with clients to help them shed the layers of unhelpful familial, societal, and cultural conditioning. But sometimes, despite great efforts by the client and therapist, the neural pathways and belief systems are so deeply entrenched that little to no improvements are made, and the mental rigidity keeping people imprisoned remains. Psychedelics create a hyperplastic window of opportunity for individuals to unlearn these processes. Many experience what is considered a paradoxical, ancient, and childlike wisdom that can engender deep self-inquiry. It is not uncommon for people to return to childlike states during the psychedelic experience. Should one get in touch with this childlike aspect of their nature and not know what to do with this, little is gained. Through the process of integration, the therapist could collaborate with the individual to identify what kind of child they were. In dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, this is a method of getting in touch with one's deepest values. Thus, to instill lasting change, the therapist might work with the person to explore the ways in which to embody those childlike qualities, putting them back in touch with their core values. For example, perhaps the person communicates with the therapist that they felt free as a child, and they come to recognize that freedom is an important personal value. To integrate this, the therapist might collaborate with the person to manifest states of freedom, maybe dancing in the rain or removing one's shoes in nature. Seemingly simple insights can also emerge during the psychedelic experience. For example, clean your room, call your parents more, drink more water, stretch more often. Again, because of the nature of psychedelics, these insights might not necessarily be new. However, they may hold more weight than your therapist encouraging you to do these things. This is a good opportunity, therefore, for the therapist to collaborate with the person to action what we call behavior activation using a scheduling system. Behavior activation is simply about increasing a person's activity levels. It is commonly used for people with depression, as these populations tend to isolate and struggle with motivation. As DBT highlights, action precedes motivation. And it is when we move our bodies that the feel-good neurotransmitter dopamine is released. So the more we increase our activity levels, the more dopamine we produce. And to increase motivation and create new healthy habits, it's a good idea to use a scheduling system by using things like financial planners. Personally, I have no idea how people can get by in the world without one. Following the use of psychedelic, the person might be much more willing to action these changes, thus assisting with the installation of new healthy habits. Common psychedelic insights include things like acceptance, which can be deeply felt during a trip. A person might already know about the importance of acceptance. However, on a psychedelic, the phenomenology or experience of acceptance can be deeply moving. Because of the hyperplastic window of opportunity, integration practices that serve to embody this concept may increase the likelihood of the individual following through with important changes needed to incorporate acceptance into their lives. From a psychologist's perspective, this could produce a great opportunity to introduce aspects of DBT, such as radical acceptance, or maybe specific exercises from acceptance and commitment therapy. Meditation practices such as mantras, loving kindness, and expanding awareness produce similar changes to the brain as psychedelics, for example, to the default mode network. Thus, during the integration phase, meditation created with the intention to consolidate the insights gained during the psychedelic experience has potential in supporting the healing process. Thus, should an insight of acceptance emerge, therapists could consider practicing a mantra-based meditation of acceptance while in session with the client. DBT also emphasizes the importance of accepting with the body. In DBT, concepts of half smile and willing hands are used to reflect an attitude of openness and acceptance. We get a lot of feedback from the body, so when we clench our fists or furrow our brows, this reflects an attitude of resistance and can further feed difficult emotional states. As we will discuss later, working with the body is an important part of the healing journey. So the following meditation that we will practice as a group is all about radically accepting with the body. Now, it's not uncommon for people to avoid being with the body, particularly in those of us who have been through trauma. So know that it's okay if difficult feelings arise during this meditation. And if you're more comfortable, you might decide to turn off your video so that you can experience the full benefits of the meditation by getting in touch with your body and emotions. Okay, so this meditation is normally done in a sitting position, either on the floor or a chair, and begins by sensing into the support you have from the chair or the cushion, paying attention to the actual sensations of contact. Finding a position of stability and poise, upper body balanced over your hips and shoulders in a comfortable but alert posture, hands on your lap or your knees, arms hanging by their own weight, like heavy curtains, stable and relaxed. Actually sensing into your body, feeling your feet, legs, hips, lower and upper body, arms, shoulders, neck, and head. And when you're ready, allowing your eyes to close, bringing awareness to breath, the actual physical sensations, feeling each breath as it comes in and goes out. Letting the breath be just as it is without trying to change or regulate it in any way. Allowing it to flow easily and naturally with its own rhythm and pace, knowing you are breathing perfectly well right now, nothing for you to do. Allowing the body to be still and sitting with a sense of dignity, a sense of resolve, a sense of being complete, whole in this very moment, with your posture reflecting the sense of wholeness. As you sit here, letting an image form in your mind's eye of the most magnificent or beautiful mountain you know or have seen or can imagine. Letting it gradually come into greater focus. And even if it doesn't come as a visual image, allowing the sense of this mountain and feeling its overall shape, its lofty peak or peaks high in the sky, the large base rooted in the bedrock of the Earth's crust, its steep or gently sloping sides. Noticing how massive it is, how solid, how unmoving, how beautiful, whether from afar or up close. Perhaps your mountain has snow blanketing its top and trees reaching down to the base or rugged granite sides. There may be streams and waterfalls cascading down the slopes. There may be one peak or a series of peaks, or with meadows and high lakes. Observing it, noting its qualities, and when you feel ready, seeing if you can bring the mountain into your body, sitting here so that your body and the mountain in your mind's eye become one, such that as you sit here, you share in the massiveness, in the stillness, in the beauty of the mountain. You become the mountain. Grounded in the sitting posture, your head becomes the lofty peak, supported by the rest of the body and affording a panoramic view. Your shoulders and arms, the sides of the mountain. Your buttocks and legs, the solid base, rooted to your cushion or your chair, experiencing in your body a sense of uplift from deep within your pelvis and spine. With each breath, as you continue sitting, becoming a little more a breathing mountain, alive and vital, yet unwavering in your inner stillness, completely what you are, beyond words and thought, a centered, grounded, unmoving presence. As you sit here, becoming aware of the fact that as the sun travels across the sky, the light and shadows and colors are changing virtually moment by moment in the mountain stillness, and the surface teems with life and activity, streams, melting snow, waterfalls, plants, and wildlife. As the mountain sits, seeing and feeling how night follows day and day follows night, the bright warming sun, followed by the cool night sky studded with stars and the gradual dawning of a new day. Through it all, the mountain just sits, experiencing change in each moment, constantly changing, yet always itself. It remains still as the seasons flow into one another, and as the weather changes moment by moment and day by day. Calmness abiding all change. In summer, there is no snow on the mountain, except perhaps for the very peaks or in crags shielded from direct sunlight. In the fall, the mountain may wear a coat of brilliant fire colors. In winter, a blanket of snow and ice. In any season, it may find itself at times enshrouded in clouds or fog or pelted by freezing rain. People may come to see the mountain and comment on how beautiful it is, or how it's not a good day to see the mountain, that it's too cloudy or rainy, foggy or dark. None of this matters to the mountain, which remains at all times its essential self. Clouds may come and clouds may go. Tourists may like it or not. The mountain's magnificence and beauty are not changed one bit by whether people see it or not. Seen or unseen, in sun or clouds, broiling or frigid, day or night. It sits, fully itself. At times visited by violent storms, buffeted by snow and rain and winds of unthinkable magnitude, through it all, the mountain sits. Spring comes, trees leaf out, flowers bloom in the high meadows and slopes, birds sing in the trees once again. Streams overflow with the waters of melting snow. Through it all, the mountain continues to sit, unmoved by the weather, by what happens on its surface, by the world of appearances, remaining its essential self through the seasons, the changing weather, the activity ebbing and flowing on its surface. In the same way, as we sit in meditation, we can learn to experience the mountain. We can embody the same central, unwavering stillness and groundedness in the face of everything that changes in our own lives over seconds, over hours, over years. In our own lives and in our meditation practice, we experience constantly the changing nature of mind and body and of the outer world. We have our own periods of light and darkness, activity and inactivity, moments of color and moments of drabness. It's true that we experience storms of varying intensity and violence in the outer world and in our own minds and bodies. Buffeted by high winds, by cold and rain, we endure periods of darkness and pain, as well as moments of joy and uplift. Even our appearance changes constantly, experiencing a weather of its own. By becoming the mountain in our meditation practice, we can link up with its strength and stability and adapt from them for our own. We can use its energies to support our energy, to encounter each moment with mindfulness, equanimity, and clarity. It may help to see that our thoughts and feelings, our preoccupations, our emotional storms and crises, even the things that happen to us, are very much like the weather on the mountain. We tend to take it all personally, but its strongest characteristic is impersonal. The weather of our own lives is not to be ignored or denied. It is to be encountered, honored, felt, known for what it is, and held in awareness. And in holding it in this way, we come to know a deeper silence and stillness and wisdom. Mountains have this to teach us, and much more if we can let it in. So if you find you resonate in some way with the strength and stability of the mountain in your sitting, it may be helpful to use it from time to time in your own meditation practice to remind you of what it means to sit mindfully with resolve and with wakefulness in true stillness. So in the time that remains, continuing to sustain the mountain meditation on your own in silence, moment by moment, until you are ready to open your eyes. So the psychedelic experience also commonly produces sacred, or what some might refer to as archetypal imagery. For example, maybe newborn babies, snakes, third eyes. Thus, the use of cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT, principle of Socratic questioning. So this is where we ask questions to help lead people to inner truths or deeper insights, could be used to reflect on this symbology further, as it can produce personal insights that transcend language. In fact, the developers of acceptance and commitment therapy are quite clear about the limitations of language and how it can contribute to psychopathology. So ineffability, again, meaning beyond words, is also a component of the mystical experience. And Stanislav Grof has stated that to integrate the psychedelic experience, one must move beyond words and consider the use of symbology that might be expressed through artistic means. For example, painting, drawing, theater, or other creative expressions. For example, I've found that by asking clients to keep an integration journal where they can record snippets of symbols and insights that emerge in these altered states, this provides a resource to devise personalized guided meditation exercises that assist to piece together the ineffable quality of these experiences. This is a collaborative creative pursuit between the client and therapist, whereby a personalized meditation using both imagery and mantras predicated on client insights can be embedded into evidence-based frameworks such as DBT, CBT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. I liken this process to a blank canvas where art is born. The blank canvas is the reset mechanism mentioned earlier. Think of a clean slate or a newborn baby entering the world. The psychedelic user begins to paint a new image, and consistent with the Socratic method, while the therapist is there to guide the strokes of the brush, they cannot force the client's hand and must remain mindful about not making assumptions or over-interpreting. And like any beautiful piece of art, we may describe what we see verbally, but words will never do it justice. Thus, like any good therapy, the incorporation of creativity into the therapeutic relationship is key. To better illustrate what I mean by ineffability, in a moment we will consider an example of an experience that might arise during a psychedelic or altered state. I'm aware of the irony here as I use words to illustrate this. Right? So when I think of an ineffable psychedelic experience, I often think of the philosophical thought experiment, Mary's Room. The experiment describes Mary, a scientist who exists in a black and white world where she knows everything there is to know about the physical descriptions of color, but no actual human perceptual experience of color. The central question of the thought experiment is whether Mary will gain new knowledge when she goes outside the black and white world and experiences seeing in color. Now, I'm of the perspective that the phenomenological experience of color is a new kind of knowledge that Mary gains only through direct experience. She might have read everything there is to know about color, but without the direct perceptual experience of a colorful world, she cannot truly know it, as it's beyond words, it's ineffable. Akin to Mary's Room, I'm of the perspective that one cannot fully appreciate altered states of consciousness by reading about them. There are states requiring direct experience to be fully understood, and this understanding often transcends language. Consider the following example of ego dissolution, a common experience in the world of psychedelia. Self disintegrates and is transformed into the hollow, empty space of an old man's flute. And from this empty space arises everything, represented by music. Now, I might use language to describe this, but no words can adequately capture the phenomenology of such an experience. Thus, beyond words, one might integrate such an experience by committing to learn how to play a flute, or perhaps meditating to Native American flute music. We have to get creative sometimes. And why might such an experience be beneficial? When self breaks down, so too does the illusion of separateness. And even from a biological vantage point, we can see the truth in this perspective. The best theory of evolution that I've come across has traced our origins to a single strand of RNA enclosed in a vesicle. We originate from a single source, and I think that this might be why there tends to be such a noetic quality of the experience of ego dissolution. Intuitively, the psychedelic user may experience the fundamental truth of no self, and paradoxically, this can be experienced as seeing self in everything. And when we come to see ourselves as inseparable from other, non-judgment and compassion are born. It becomes almost self-destructive not to exercise altruism. It becomes foolish to condemn the darkness in others when you see yourself reflected back. Psychedelics can help people to relinquish rigid notions of identity that are often predicated on narrow parameters of external achievement, societal expectations, and the shallow opinions of others. The psychedelic user has an opportunity to view self as existing at the center of and along an infinitely expanding nothing-everything continuum. Or as a clever character put it to me once, the point of emergence, a common experience reported at higher doses of ketamine. These kinds of experiences are profound, and while research is needed to explore this, seem to produce substantial change only when integrated. Now, intuitively, this makes sense. If I see myself as both nothing and everything and fundamentally inseparable from others, and I go home and I write about it, read about it, meditate on it, should someone criticize my character, appearance, or profession, it will be much easier for me to mindfully choose non-action, or in Taoist philosophy, the way. And by non-action, I mean not reacting from a place of impulsivity. On the other hand, if I have such revelations while on psilocybin and don't reflect on it in the days, weeks, or months that follow, I will be much more likely to fall back into unconscious reactive patterns. The problem we're often faced with is that we can have these profound psychedelic experiences, fail to integrate them, and then return to an individualistic material culture that often serves the function of reinforcing inflexible narratives. It is much easier to find enlightenment when you're the stone Buddha living in the forest deep within the mountains. I think that as individuals living in mainstream society, integration practice is essential to facilitating lasting change. As practitioners, we must also recognize the role of emotional memory in the maintenance of core beliefs. Taken from schema therapy, I often devise imagery rescripting exercises whereby the person is asked to revisit a difficult memory and elements of that memory are rescripted, assisting to tap into a person's emotional memory. Imagery rescripting is gaining more attention in the literature, producing promising results when embedded into existing evidence-based frameworks. I have the individual identify the age of onset of the core belief and what was happening for them at that time in their life. I then ask the person what their needs were at that time and help them to meet those needs by holding in mind an image of a supportive presence or figure. The presence is there to support the younger parts of themselves to meet those needs that went unmet, which ultimately contributed to the generation of maladaptive beliefs. In the context of integration, this therapeutic modality is useful, as psychedelic users often report beings or other supportive presences deemed to have a healing effect. Thus, using that same imagery, integration could involve incorporating the use of this presence into the rescripting process. I've also implemented imagery rescripting of traumatic psychedelic experiences to help foster a sense of acceptance and resolve. While traumatic memories are stored in explicit memory, which is readily available to conscious awareness, trauma is also stored in implicit or emotional memory, which is largely unconscious. Thus, the premise of an imagery rescripting is to shift the emotional memory at the root of trauma. I've been working with some people who have had incredibly traumatic psychedelic experiences who years later continue to exhibit symptoms of post-traumatic stress. There is a technique I use whereby elements of schema therapy and mindfulness are interwoven into a CBT framework that I have found to deeply resonate with trauma clients in my general clinical practice. Recently, I've been using this approach quite successfully with integration clients who have had traumatic psychedelic experiences. I ask the person to hold in mind the setting with which the psychedelic was taken and re-script the memory such that positive emotions and revelations are elicited. I incorporate the use of supportive presences, body scanning, and metta bhavana, or loving kindness meditation. So the body scanning and loving kindness elements of this exercise involve asking the person to envision sending a light of compassion or love or acceptance, starting at their toes and gradually moving its way up to the crown of the head, with an emphasis on sending this light to areas of the body where difficult emotions are held. The location of painful emotions in the body is consistent with the embodiment principle from Dr. Watts's ACE model of psychedelic therapy, which I will describe in a little more detail shortly. Many mainstream psychotherapies ignore the body in the same way that mainstream medicine often ignores the mind. Again, this illustrates the illusion of separateness. Neuroscience has shown time and time again that the body and mind are one. And if you want proof of this, check out Robert Sapolsky's work. Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, illustrates the importance of working with the body when moving through trauma. It is worth noting that psychedelic research has found that a state of total acceptance or surrender seems to predict mystical experiences, which have been linked to long-term positive change. Conversely, it is well known that resistance is more likely to result in challenging or possibly even traumatic psychedelic experiences. Therefore, while revisiting the traumatic psychedelic memory, during the exercise, I also encourage the person to adopt an attitude of acceptance and surrender to any difficult emotions that might arise. As mentioned, during the psychedelic experience, it is not uncommon for people to encounter aspects of their younger selves, which can engender images, for example, of a hurt child. Thus, other aspects of schema therapy, such as the mode map, could be used to integrate this further. The mode map is used to help people get in touch with the various parts of themselves to foster greater self-knowledge, compassion, and insight. For example, one of the modes recognized in schema therapy is the angry child. As humans, we often suppress certain aspects of our nature, especially those deemed to be threatening. Thus, it can be helpful for people to get in touch with the various parts of themselves. Internal family systems therapy draws upon a similar approach whereby rather than pathologizing or viewing these parts negatively, compassionate inquiry is used to explore their function. Therefore, the parts of a person that might emerge or be depicted through imagery during the psychedelic experience could be useful to embed within the framework of schema or internal family systems therapy. As discussed, one of the most notable mechanisms by which psychedelics are thought to exert their effects is by increasing psychological flexibility. Thus, the days or weeks following a psychedelic experience in which integration is action provides a great opportunity for cognitive restructuring or challenging of unhelpful thoughts. Dr. Rosalind Watts from Imperial College proposes an ACE, so Accept, Connect, Embody model of psychedelic therapy. And the primary aim of this model is to increase psychological flexibility using principles consistent with acceptance and commitment therapy. For example, remaining in the present moment, the acceptance of difficult emotions, cognitive diffusion, so i.e. the realization that our thoughts aren't inherently true, and identifying or connecting with meaningful values. Increasing psychological flexibility can also be achieved through traditional cognitive behavioral therapy methods. CBT therapists are painfully aware of the rigidity of core beliefs. For example, I am worthless, I am unlovable, I am a failure, to name a few. And even when people recognize the irrationality of such beliefs, they often remain firmly held. Thus, the hyperplastic window of opportunity following the use of psychedelics has great potential in rendering these maladaptive core beliefs more amenable to change. For example, perhaps a person is suffering with body image disturbance. They might think to themselves, I'm fat. And through the process of inquiry using CBT principles, such as the downward arrow technique, this is where you ask questions to break down surface level thoughts, such as, well, what does this mean for me? Or if-then statements. For example, if I am fat, then I am not as good as other people. And we come to discover that what they really believe is that because they perceive themselves as fat, they're worthless. During and following the psychedelic experience, a person might be much more open to redefining their self-worth such that it is predicated on inner qualities like kindness, compassion, or generosity. Following cognitive restructuring of body image concerns, mantra-based meditation, so for example, repeating the phrase, I am enough or I am compassionate, may help to further consolidate this newer, more flexible and compassionate narrative, thus consolidating the rewiring of new neural pathways. Remember that the maladaptive core beliefs feel more valid because they've been on repeat for so long, kind of like the annoying radio song that gets stuck in your head. So thought challenging can be followed by the use of mantras that serve to consolidate newer, more flexible narratives by the process of repetition. And through that repetition, we may begin to override the annoying song. Because a feeling of sacredness can arise during the psychedelic experience, integration might be used to facilitate an environment predicated on ritual. After all, humans evolved around ritualistic practices, and psychedelics such as psilocybin, mescaline, and ayahuasca have been used in ceremonial settings for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Thus, a person who commits to the practice of mantra-based meditations to consolidate new learning might consider setting up a room in the house that they use specifically for this reason. This might include the incorporation of burning sage, incense, candles, playing Native American flute music, Tibetan singing bowls, or the inclusion of any other practice considered sacred or meaningful to that individual person. Following the use of a psychedelic, it is not uncommon for people to report newfound novelty in their day-to-day lives. For example, we might walk down the same street we had traveled upon for decades, yet experience it for the first time. Mindfulness might become a new natural way of being. The integration of mindfulness-based teachings is thus a powerful tool. This could be supported by reading books or listening to audiobooks depicting deeper philosophical mindfulness-based concepts. For example, some of my favorites include Taoism, Buddhism, the Stoics, Khalil Gibran, Alan Watts, Eckhart Tolle, Thich Nhat Hanh. And while meditation is one example of mindfulness practice, the good thing about mindfulness is that it can be used anytime, anywhere. The DBT observation skills explore the use of the 5 senses to bring all of our attention to the present moment. So as a group, let's spend a moment grounding ourselves by connecting with each of the 5 senses. As human beings, we can become addicted to thought. Attachment to these inner narratives can generate a lot of unnecessary suffering. Much suffering arises when we cling to thoughts about the past and the future. Therefore, it can be incredibly healing to direct our attention to the present moment, which can be facilitated by connecting with the 5 senses: taste, touch, sound, smell, and sight. So to begin, spend a moment making yourself comfortable in a seated position or laying down if you prefer. When you're ready, close your eyes, bringing all of your attention to your breath. While there is no need to breathe in any particular way, if you notice shallow or rapid breathing, you might want to try slowing down the breath. Generally, it's a good idea to breathe out longer than you breathe in, as this is when we activate the parasympathetic nervous system or rest and relaxation response. For this exercise, we will focus on each of the 5 seconds for approximately 30 seconds, one at a time. When using this exercise on your own, you might decide to spend more time on each sense. There's no right or wrong way of going about this. Let's start by focusing our attention on our sense of taste. To complete this, there's no need to have any food, drink, gum, or mints in your mouth. As you become more aware, you might notice the aftertaste of food or drink. To help increase awareness, you might decide to roll your tongue around or rest it on your teeth. Spend the next few moments connecting in with your sense of taste, bringing stillness into your body. Moving on to your sense of touch. Spend the next 30 seconds noticing the feeling of the furniture under your skin, or if you're outside, the feeling of the earth under your feet. Take a moment to feel any objects that surround you, noticing the textures and shapes. As you do so, try not to label what it is that you feel, simply observe the sensations. Moving on to your sense of sound. Begin by opening your awareness to the sounds of your environment. If you were indoors, perhaps you may begin to hear sounds that previously went unnoticed. The furnace, purring of a cat, laughter of a child. Perhaps you notice the sounds of passing vehicles, planes, or trains. If you're outside, perhaps you notice the sounds of animals or the crash of the ocean waves. You might also notice internal sounds, such as your breath or digestion. Spend a moment connecting in with your sense of sound. Moving on to your sense of smell. Begin by directing all of your attention to the smells of your environment. The lingering scent of candles, incense, or sage. Perhaps you smell the spices of a previous meal in the air. If you are outside, you might start to notice the smell of grass, trees, or flowers. Spend a moment connecting in with your sense of smell. Finally, if you had your eyes closed, please gently open them and spend the next 30 or so seconds bringing all your attention to your sense of sight. Begin by noticing the colors, shapes, and sizes of the objects in your environment. You might begin to perceive things that previously went unnoticed. Spend the next 20 seconds connecting in with your sense of sight. When you are ready, take another 3 slow rounds of breath, putting all of your attention onto the inhale, exhale, and space in between. Allow your mind to become centered as you slowly reawaken your body. And when you are ready, return your attention back to this space. So the best definition of enlightenment that I've come across has been by A.H. Almas. He says that enlightenment is the freedom for reality to experience itself without restraint. When we fully participate in the moment through observation, we become pure awareness. People may report experiencing no separation between the inner and outer world. The ego boundaries dissolve. As alluded to earlier, with balance, this can be useful. We might start to recognize that we are seeing reality clearly again, almost as though we are seeing the world through the eyes of a small child. It may become apparent that we had previously been looking outside a dirty window. While we could still see outside, our perception was distorted. And what is depression but tunnel vision, resulting in a loss of connection with self, others, and nature? When we integrate pure awareness back into our lives, we remember what it is like to be truly free of rigid narratives, free of judgment, and free of unnecessary suffering. In recent times, I've come to recognize the wisdom in cliche sayings like stop and smell the roses. I often share with my clients that when I take mindful walks, I stop and touch the flowers and trees. I recognize that this might appear strange to other people, but fundamentally, I know that this is even stranger that people find this strange in the first place. Personally, if I saw someone hugging a tree, I would stop to congratulate them. I might even join them. As a society, we've become so disconnected from nature, forgetting that we are nature. Psychedelics can, of course, be very confronting. Therefore, I think it's important for users to be aware that they might be shown the darkest parts of their nature. In Jungian terms, Carl Jung being a Swiss psychiatrist, this might be considered shadow work. As mentioned, psychedelic research suggests that total acceptance or surrender is an important predictor of therapeutic outcomes. Therefore, it is important for therapists to support the individual to hold space for that darkness, both during, if working with people on clinical trials or special access schemes, and following the psychedelic experience. As human beings, we often underestimate what we are capable of, both good and bad. And for growth to occur, it is important that we acknowledge both our light and dark seeds. While this might seem extreme, I agree with what Jordan Peterson says about recognizing our capacity to be the serial killer. And what I mean by this is recognizing that psychedelics often require us to go into the deepest, darkest well of our nature and acknowledge our own potential for malvoyance. It is only through that darkness that we can transcend it, recreating ourselves by directing that dark energy usefully. Thus, as a therapist, should that darkness be encountered during the integration process, it is important to encourage the use of non-judgmental and compassionate self-inquiry, as this is an opportunity for deep self-awareness. While we can never force the silver lining upon another person, much can be learned from those darkest states. Perhaps while under the influence of psilocybin, the person was shown qualities about themselves that they're ashamed of and ultimately deny or suppress. Due to the nature of psychedelics, this might be presented to a person in a terrifying image. If the individual turns away from this and resists what is trying to surface, as mentioned, they may be much more likely to have what some might call a bad trip. This can produce lasting negative effects when not integrated properly. Again, the use of DBT principles, which have modules on non-judgment, loving kindness, and wisdom, may be implemented to assist the person to turn toward that darkness such that it can be worked through. Like any traumatic experience, to transcend it, we must go through it. While turning away from it and avoiding it are understandable, it maintains the distress in the long run. To better illustrate how one might turn toward the darkness using DBT principles of compassion and inner wisdom, you can visit our website where we have pre-recorded a meditation that we created to illustrate this concept. As described earlier, I've met with a few individuals who have had extremely difficult trips that they described as traumatic. Through compassionate inquiry and the implementation of evidence-based approaches, I've seen people come to a place of acceptance and resolve, ultimately making peace with their experiences. For me personally, this really attested to the importance of integration. As ketamine becomes more available throughout Australia, I personally think it's important that more practitioners who are educated about psychedelics and the process of integration be made available for these patients. Patients are often given ketamine in sterile environments with little to no psychotherapeutic follow-up, but ketamine can produce incredibly powerful mystical experiences warranting integration. I've had the privilege of meeting with people who have been prescribed ketamine, and the same principles of integration have applied. Other modalities of integration might include things like yoga, spending time in nature or in cemeteries, sweat lodges, float tanks, talking about it with trusted people or community of people who have a background or education on the nature of psychedelics, or maybe those who have experience with altered states of consciousness, journaling, breath work, for example, holotropic breath work, or my personal favorite thus far, Wim Hof, always coupling those with cold showers, dance, pottery, knitting, skydiving, playing music. I've also met with people who find tarot cards useful to their integration practice. Everyone has different needs at different times in their development, and it's important to find the things that suit our individual needs. So in summary, psychedelics are not a panacea. They're not a one-size-fits-all. And at Enlighten, we're not advocating for recreational use, as we've mentioned, but rather we acknowledge that people are using these substances anyways and are thus deserving of accurate information and, if warranted, an opportunity to share their experiences. So if you want to connect with us, you can follow us on social media or access our website and phone number shown on the screen. And I think now we're going to transition to questions. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Shevaugn, for that insightful presentation and those incredible integration experiences. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. There we go. Thank you. I don't know how you guys went with that, but in that first exercise, I became the mountain. So that was an incredible experience. Thank you so much for that. And the second one was amazing as well. I just wanted to say thank you so much to the APS. And if you've enjoyed this presentation, please show your appreciation by donating to the APS. But before we go, my phone's been blowing up this whole presentation. Hello to everyone out there. Thank you so much for your support. Hi, Chris, and the 8 people who are with you watching this. Hi, Jake. Hi, Natalie. Thank you so much for tuning in. Hi, everyone. What I will just do before we pass back over to the APS, I've missed a really important slide that if I don't share, I fear I may be in a little bit of trouble. The thank you slide, of course. Thank you guys so much. And of course, donate to the APS. And the final slide. Here's the list of references. And if you want a full list of them, I will be uploading them to the website later on this week. And of course, now I believe we will be moving into 15 minutes of Q&A. So I'll hand back across to Meredith and to Nika to run that.
Thanks so much, Eternity. And thank you so much to Shevaugn for that incredible and insightful presentation and leading us through that beautiful meditation earlier. Eternity, if you're able to stop sharing your screen, that would be fantastic. Although I did enjoy the Q&A kind of popping up there. Thank you again, Shevaugn, and please have a look in the chat. There's a lot of great comments from people who just really found that presentation so fantastic and really enlightening and insightful. There's a couple of questions that have come through the Q&A box. And they are some fantastic questions. So we'll just go through them. And please, if anything comes up, anyone still watching, anything comes up for you as we're going through these questions, please feel free to add a few more in the chat. Okay, so the first question is anonymous. And the person asks, can you explain more about how efficacy is determined in the mentioned clinical trials, so Friston and Carhart Harris, etc.? What exactly are the metrics?
So, yeah, it really depends on what you're looking at. Carhart Harris and colleagues have produced a lot of research on treatment-resistant depression. So they'll be looking at different psychometric tools that might assess for depression. They'll also be looking at other things like anxiety, I think in some of them, some suicide measures. So, yeah, if you want to know a bit more specific information about that, you should be able to hop onto Google Scholar. A lot of these papers have free links that even if you don't have a university affiliation, you should be able to click on the link. And if you just go to the measures section, you can actually see the specific outcome variables that they're measuring.
Great, thank you. I imagine, as you said, it would be different for every research paper. It would be measured differently. So, yeah, that's great. Thank you. This next question comes from Erezu Akbarian. I hope I said your name right. They ask, I'm wondering whether you have some thoughts about the DSM-5 diagnosis of hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, or HPPD, and how to best support someone experiencing these symptoms.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So there's been a little bit of research, and they found that there are relatively low rates of HPPD. So for those of you who don't know, HPPD is where a person will use a psychedelic and have ongoing perceptual disturbances. So they might continue to perceive things, for example, visually that aren't there. Tinnitus might be another example. And in terms of best supporting them, I think that it can absolutely be a very, very traumatic experience. And I would say to support those individuals who are experiencing HPPD in a similar way that you would support somebody experiencing trauma, with compassion, non-judgment, validation, and really the act of compassionate listening is so powerful. I find that a lot of the issues that people run into when we're trying to help each other is that we put too much emphasis on advising, trying to problem solve. But a lot of the time when we're dealing with traumatic or extremely challenging situations, what we really need from people is someone to listen, someone to show that compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what people need the most, is just having that support, and that support to be ongoing. Thank you. There's some more questions coming in, which are fantastic. A great question here from EN. They ask, how might undergraduate students who are interested in psychedelic assisted therapy begin to accrue experience and accreditation in this space, as the incorporation into clinical training is still quite nascent?
Thank you. That's also a really, really good question. I think that finding a supervisor who's perhaps willing to supervise a research project relating to psychedelics, of course, getting involved with volunteer work, maybe around the APS. And I think a big thing is just getting involved with the community and understanding it from that vantage point as well. So you're right that there isn't any formal kind of accreditation program at this stage. I think that we're going to see that happening in the coming years, especially with all these clinical trials that will be popping up. So there might be more formal ways of going about training that are accredited and that you could actually use towards something related to psychedelics in the future.
Great, thank you. It is emerging, so it is very much a watch this space. Question here from Stephen. He asks, does integration and its associated experience need to be repeated to remain effective and act to prevent relapse for previous patterns of behaviour?
Yeah, I think that with any time that you're trying to alter a previously held rigid thought or behavioral pattern, the more that you implement newer, healthier habits or thought processes, the better the effect. Like we think about Donald Hebb and the neurons that fire together, wire together. And you might think of that process of neuroplasticity as, a valley. And the more that we engage in certain thoughts or behaviors, we're digging deep trenches in that valley. And so when it rains, you become much more likely to drown, right? So we have to start digging new trenches in that valley. And it's always difficult initially, but the more and more effort that you put into that, the more neuroplasticity that you're forming, and the better the outcome, the more longer lasting and effective that change will be.
Great. Thank you, Shevaugn. I'm aware that it is 9:01, but we might go for another 5 or so minutes because there's some great questions in here, and we want to ensure that Shevaugn is able to answer them while we have her here. This is a great question for medical professionals, from a medical professional. So this is from Sam. And Sam asks, as medical professionals, once these therapies are made available, how do we handle the situation of transitioning an individual who is on antidepressants, which may be contraindicated? Does an individual have to taper off their medication under supervision and then have the psychedelic therapy? This could lead to a number of risky situations, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Obviously, personally, I can't make any specific recommendations around that because it's sort of outside of my role to do that. But if you look at clinical trials, what they often do is have that individual person collaborate with their prescribing practitioner to gradually taper off that medication. From memory, I think sometimes it's somewhere around like 6 half-lives or something like that. It might depend on what the medication is. And another thing, of course, to bear in mind is that we have to really emphasize informed consent there. The person has to be made aware of the potential risks involved with that process. So it is a bit of a tricky area. Obviously, when we were coming off of a medication like that, there can be side effects or, relapses in mental health. So there's definitely risk. And I think that provided that person is given all of the information and we're actively collaborating with the prescribing practitioner, then that's the most ethical way of going about it.
Thank you. Okay, we'll do just a couple more questions. So here's a great question that I think you in Eternity would be able to answer very well. Gary asks, how do I find an integration therapist? Do they need to be done in person?
That's a good question. So obviously, you can contact us. There are, I think, certain websites available out there that list like psychedelic friendly therapists. So I think it's just really about doing your research and looking at platforms where there are people who are sort of advertising that, hey, I won't judge you if you tell me that you're using mushrooms, and maybe I know a thing or two about it. So yeah, there are, I believe, as far as I've heard, a couple of platforms that provide lists of people's names, and then of course you can always contact us.
Great, thank you. And do reach out to Enlighten Mental Health if you are seeking a practitioner. And I will share the details of, obviously Shevaugn has shared them, but I'll share them at the end as well. Okay, we have time for one more question. And this is from Andrea. And Andrea asks, wondering on opinions on post-psychedelic. Oh, this is more about opinions. So we might hold that for now, Andrea, and I'll just choose one more question. Is ego death, and probably you could take a while to answer this, is ego death during a psychedelic experience important in terms of therapeutic outcomes?
I think that it can be important, and ego dissolution has also been found to be one of those predictors of outcomes. And like the example that I gave of, your self disintegrates and you become the space in the hollow space of the old man's flute, and then you're sort of transcended into everything, that can have a very powerful impact on a person's day-to-day life. Again, if integrated properly, we have to really look at that. Well, what does that really mean, right? And you get into that deep nature of the paradoxicality of the psychedelic experience. And so I think that it absolutely, first it can be terrifying sometimes for people if they're having ego death, because they might literally think that they are dying. But again, if you surrender to that experience and you accept that experience for what it is, it can be incredibly beautiful and empowering. For example, perhaps someone's in the forest and they're, sitting in a hammock and they're looking at a tree, and all of a sudden they lose sense of that connection with their body, not in a scary way, but in a way where there's no differentiation of self from the wind, self from the tree. And that can be an incredibly connecting experience, that profound connection with nature, for example. So I think that it really depends on the attitude that you're going into it with. If you resist it and it's something that you perceive as very threatening and scary, then it can be a recipe for a bad trip. But if you embrace that and surrender to that experience, it can be a profoundly moving and life-changing experience. It really just depends case by case.
That's a beautiful answer, and all about how you go into it and surrendering to the experience. Thank you so much again to Dr. Shevaugn Johnson from Enlighten Mental Health for this incredible presentation and incredible insights. I would say please give a round of applause to Shevaugn wherever you are. But thank you so much for joining us tonight, and to Enlighten Mental Health. So before we finish up tonight, there are a couple of thanks that I do need to make. As I said before, a huge thank you to Shevaugn and Eternity from Enlighten Mental Health. Thank you to Antonika Holton and Jeff Baker from the Australian Psychedelic Society for technical support. And a big thank you to everyone who has tuned in tonight. I know in this strange time we can all experience a lot of Zoom fatigue, but you've been such great sports, and thank you for all of your brilliant questions and comments and insights. A huge thank you as well to everyone who has donated money to the APS. We have raised over $400, and we are incredibly grateful for all of your support. I'm going to share one more slide just with our contact details so that you can get in touch with us. So as you can see here, if you want to get in touch with the Australian Psychedelic Society, please head to www.psychedelicsociety.org.au. For information about Enlighten Mental Health and the services that they have to offer, please head to enlightenmentalhealthaustralia.org, and you can see our email contacts there as well. We do encourage you to sign up to the APS newsletter and our YouTube channel as well, which you can do through our website. And this webinar will be uploaded to our YouTube channel very, very shortly. So again, thank you all so much for coming, and have a wonderful evening. Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you so much for hosting us tonight. It was an absolute pleasure. And yeah, thank you very much, Shevaugn. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
It's brilliant.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everybody.
Bye.